Hello, Yakri here with another artifact video. So today I want to talk about levels of play. It might not always go by this name, but this is I think this is a kind of a general concept in card games or in gaming, or at least parts of it are, and parts of it are my own ideas. And the idea isn't levels of play in the sense of like high level plays, low level plays, as in like super smart versus not smart necessarily. It's rather the idea of something being like at a low level of abstraction, something being kind of obvious and upfront, and something being at a high level of abstraction, right? Something being very like obtuse and like abstracted from gameplay. And so we're going to talk first about deck building, okay? Or even this is sort of a little bit too related to be its own separate topic, but meta knowledge, right? So meta knowledge is like the most abstract high level of play. Choosing the cards you put into a particular type of deck, a specific version of a particular type of deck. So if you're playing, all right, I've got a picture of it on here, blue-black control. And in the meta right now that red-green aggro is extremely good, okay? You might put in cards to counter red-green aggro into your deck, something that perhaps people don't usually do in blue-black control, or perhaps the people weren't doing in blue-black control when it became popularized. And let's say there's some deck that most people are copying off of, and it does not have counters for red-green aggro, and so red-green aggro gains popularity because it can beat blue-black control. And so you play a version of blue-black control that is heavily tailored to counter red-green aggro, and that has a couple of advantages. For one, of course, you're still playing this deck that was strong for some reason, and you're playing it with counters to your biggest weakness. This, of course, probably opens up some new weaknesses in your deck if the game is well designed, but it also subverts the expectations of your opponent. They see a blue-black control deck as a red-green aggro deck, and they think, I've got an easy time here. That's what they're used to. They're used to winning against these decks. They're used to these decks playing a certain way. And if you've made significant enough changes to your deck, you can bring out these counter cards that are going to surprise them and perhaps give you an advantage. Okay, so that's like the meta level of play, okay? And that goes into deck building and the deck building level of play, which is essentially tailoring your deck to meet your play style, the current meta, and the situation you might be in. I'm not sure if some of this doesn't apply as much to Artifact, perhaps, as to other games, but you can do stuff as simple as, for no real specific reason, changing up the cards in your deck, just in order to make your deck different from what other people might expect, okay? So let's say deck A. Why don't we pick colors for it? Let's say blue-black. I already said blue-black, huh? Blue-red. A blue-red deck gains a lot of popularity, and it's very good, and a version of it wins a tournament, and a ton of people start copying that version that wins a tournament. This might be sounding familiar to you already. You might want to change out some of the cards in that deck for other cards that have the same purpose, right? At the same like point in your play. However, that although they have the same purpose, they have different weaknesses. So that when people are trying to exploit the weaknesses of your deck, it isn't quite what they expect it to be. And you can even make more significant changes to the deck than that. And it can even be, in some ways, beneficial to play a deck where people are, it's kind of got the signature of this deck that people are used to, but in fact, perhaps the core of the deck or like enough of the trappings of the deck have been changed to make it play significantly differently and give you an advantage. And so, and it can also go into this level of even just straight up playing counter meta decks, right? So not just adapting a deck to the meta, but building a deck that counters the top meta decks, and might not be good as soon as the meta shifts, but will be good against the decks that are currently top in the meta. Okay, so there's that element there too, right? I mean, you're playing around the meta, not just in the cards you choose within decks, but in the decks you choose at all. So there's definitely a big element that goes to deck building there. That's an element of play, an element of skill, and understanding deck building can be important. To understand it to at least to a certain degree, even if you aren't building decks, okay? You need to know how to build decks so that you know how to understand the decks that you are playing better, how to customize them for the meta, and how to understand the decks that your opponents are playing better and that your opponents might choose to play against you. So there's this kind of like really abstract, I don't even know, countering and counter thinking that you're doing before you ever get into a match. Or you may not be doing it, but you can be doing it, and I assure you that the best players in the game are doing at least some part of this. I wouldn't count myself among them, so take it with a grain of salt. I have a decent amount of experience, but I'm not a pro. So anyway, the next level of skill is kind of how you start the game. This is gonna depend a bit more on individual games, right? Individual games are going to have different mechanics for the start of the game. For Artifact, there's actually a lot less than in some games, right? So if you have a mulligan, you might mulligan differently against different decks. You might mulligan differently with different decks, and you might mulligan differently to suit different play styles with the same deck. But Artifact does not have that. So instead you would only have your starting hero placement, which can be important, but I think it's a fairly de-emphasized element of the gameplay. So let's just move along to talking about the actual gameplay. And so I started with a very high-level element. I'm not actually going to be going in order of like most abstract to least abstract. I know it's a little confusing, but I think it's kind of important to skip around here a bit. So once you get into the game, there's a very obvious unabstract element. Like this is kind of like the next thing you're going to sink into, because building a deck, like the fact that you have to build a deck is kind of obvious to people, and they might just copy one from online, but at least it's kind of presented to you. But once you get in game, people tend to fixate on the board, right? And there's something I've heard. This phrase kind of in my days playing Magic the Gathering. I've definitely heard Hearthstone players say it mostly in terms of like saying like, oh, if someone's bad if they're just playing the board, right? If that's all they know how to do. And the idea is that you see this board state, right? Okay, so let's say hypothetically you're the Radiant player here, and so you see that you're not doing too well in the current board state. Your hero's dying, and this creep's dying, and their hero's dying. But let's say you actually want your hero. You think you want your hero to die, maybe, right? You're at least okay with it as long as Zeus dies as well, right? But you don't want them to have like this presence of this guy still being here on the board. So you kill him with a spell, okay? No accident can do it, yeah. Okay, so you kill him with a spell. And you're pretty happy about this. This is what you wanted. You want everyone to die. But you're only playing at the level of the board, right? You don't think through what your opponent might do. You just play the board. You improve the board state for yourself. Now you're happy. Well, now it's Dire's turn. And let's say, hypothetically, that Dire didn't have Grazing Shot. Let's say they had no accident as well, or the Grazing Shot did 3 damage, right? So this hypothetical scenario, didn't find the perfect screenshot for it, but they use this to kill Phantom Assassin, right? Well, once Phantom Assassin is dead, you can no longer, as Radiant, cast any spells in Artifact. You're completely shut out of this board, and now Zeus is going to live. And so you have this scenario where your hero is not, I believe Phantom Assassin does not have rapid replay. I forget what Blink Strike does, but yeah, you are going to have no presence on this board. These minions trade, this is done, and Zeus is by himself, but maybe Dire is okay with that, right? And in fact, if Phantom Assassin was lower on HP and could be killed by Grazing Shot, Dire could drop Disciple of Nevermore in order to just deal more damage to the tower, and it might be a pretty good decision. Yeah, and you still have Zeus here, and suddenly your positions become much worse because you didn't really think through your actions, right? Maybe what would be better to do would be to kill off Zeus, right? And now you've still got this, what is it, untested Grunt, I think? And you've still got untested Grunt hitting your tower, but you still have Phantom Assassin here in the lane. You can still use abilities next turn, and Zeus is gone, and they can't do anything to respond. And you're going to be trading tower damage with them, and maybe that's the better scenario right here, right? As opposed to just completely giving up this lane, I think is what happens if you make that mistake. And And so the point I'm making here is that this more abstract level of play, that when you come into the game, is playing around the level of your hand and your opponent's hand, playing around what your opponent has in their hand, even when you don't know. There's a lot of hints you can get about what your opponent may very well have in their hand. If you know what deck they're running and how that deck plays and what turns it typically drops what cards at, and yeah, and you pay attention to what your opponent has done so far, you can get a good guess, if you're a very good player especially, of what your opponent has in hand, and you can play around that. And that's a very important aspect of gameplay that is, of course, for clear reasons, not obvious to new players right off, unless you have prior card game experience, which I wouldn't really call you a new player, I guess, by these standards. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. This level of play of playing the board. Playing the board is kind of, I skipped all the way to the bottom, I guess, the most obvious direct thing, right? You see the board state in front of you. It's very clearly laid out, especially in Artifact, and you manipulate it to improve your situation. And I guess the point I'm making is that you can't just stop there if you want to be good at playing card games, and especially not in Artifact. So let's move it back up. Now that I've explained the most and least abstract layers, right? So when you get into the game, I'm not sure if I want to say that your opponent and their hand is the second most abstract layer, or if the board, the whole board. I don't know, you just said that that's the least abstract layer, but let me explain a sec. So there are 3 boards, right, in Artifact. And there's a layer above the direct board layer where you say, like, okay, I've got this situation we've got going on right now, and I need to influence it in some way to gain advantage. That's the lowest level layer of just this particular board. But there's the whole board state. There's the 3 boards you have, the places your heroes are placed, the places your opponent's heroes are placed, and which boards you're going to want to try and win, and which one you want to try and sacrifice in order to achieve victory, and how much you want to sacrifice your sacrifice board, if at all. Okay, you probably do want to sacrifice one board. It seems to be the way to go right now. But you might not in some situations, and you probably don't want to all the way, especially versus some decks. Fully abandoning a board could lead to a loss. So you have like a meta layer of board states to manipulate, right? And I think it would be below your opponent and their cards, right? So I guess the next layer after deck building is, in fact, your opponent, the cards that they have, and the deck that they're playing, right? As well as the cards you have in the deck you're playing. So it's this game of where it's the mind games layer, right? And I find it pretty difficult in online card games, right? I played Magic the Gathering for a long time in person, and I think you wouldn't know it from seeing me in any other context, but my strength was always having a really good poker face. I pretty much just looked like a, corpse the whole time, with the ability to once in a while trick people into thinking I had a good hand when I didn't, or the other way around. So I managed to do a pretty good job of that with my resting bitch face, but I was never as good at reading people. It's kind of my main weakness, right? And it's an important part of card games. And the thing is that it doesn't become unimportant when you can't see your opponent. It just becomes more difficult. It's really, really important to figure out what your opponent is thinking, what they're going to do, and what their playstyle is, what kind of deck they're playing. Because even if you recognize the type of deck they're playing, they could have customized it extensively. They could be a great deck builder, and they could have extensive meta knowledge of the game. And you have to think, like, okay, what have I seen so far from them? What knowledge do I have, and how have I seen them play? And you have to anticipate what they are going to do. And it's just super, super important. It's how a lot of these games are decided, I think. I don't think that's a particularly controversial opinion, right? So that's where a huge element of skill comes in, and it's very difficult when you can't see your opponent. So you have to take advantage of any tells you can get. I can't remember which games have it, but I'm not sure, and I'm also not sure we've seen much of the actual human player versus another human player in-game interface, not the spectator interface. But being able to see the cards your opponent is mousing over and stuff can be very helpful sometimes, as well as seeing the actual plays that they make. So where was I going with this? Right, so I think we've got like fairly decent delineation of abstraction layers, right? You've got deck building and metagame outside the game. Highest level of abstraction, it's all the stuff you do before you ever actually get into the game. Very important to consider, even if, you know, I mean, all of this is like has the asterisk tagged on. If you want to get really good at the game, you should do this. But if you don't care, then, I mean, do whatever you want, right? Just have fun. But if you do want to do well, if you want to get better at the game, you want to do well, you do have to consider that element in, you know, deck building card games, right? In any TCG of this style, it's going to be important. So then you get into the game, and you've got this level of figuring out your opponent's deck, figuring out your opponent's playstyle, and then playing around what they might have in their hand, and tricking them into hopefully playing around things you don't have access to and don't have at all, or can't do. So there's like the mind games and the baiting your opponent and tricking them and playing around their traps and tricks as well correctly. So once you get past that, then you've got another layer in Artifact, I think. And this is one thing I really like, because I would have called, I guess, the initial mulligan kind of a layer of play, right, in other games. Not a substantial one, right? But it's a thing. And then in games like Hearthstone in particular, right, the final layer, the board state, is way more important than it is an Artifact, right? And I don't like that, actually. It's most important in Hearthstone, second most important in Magic the Gathering, and least important in Artifact out of those three games, and I think they're the best games to compare to each other. And I really like that it's least important in Artifact, and here's why. In Hearthstone, there is pretty much a best board state, right, in terms of attacking and blocking creatures, right? It's something you actually do manually in Hearthstone. You like actually, you have the most control over it in Hearthstone, I guess, and so it has the biggest impact, where you actually choose who you're going to attack at the end of your turn, right, with your creatures. And then there's like defender creatures. I forget, what is it called, defender in Hearthstone? I forget. But so it's the biggest impact in Hearthstone, and in Magic it's a little bit less of an impact, I think, with since you kind of just attack the player and you don't get to freely attack minions and stuff, so you can't use minions as removal. And then it's least impactful in Artifact because you can only indirectly influence the actions of your minions and your heroes and how they attack, except for if you play a spell to actually directly influence it, right? So why do I like that? It's because, kind of said it partly already. There is a best set of choices you can make at the end of your turn in Hearthstone, right? It's not very interactive. It's just you're there and you pick the best best trade targets and you go. That's it. And you should be able to do it right every single time if you're good enough at the game. And in Magic the Gathering, it's pretty similar. I think it's a little bit better in Magic because your opponent, you make some choices, then your opponent makes some choices, and it's possible that you've faked out your opponent in some way, and they will assign blockers. And then you'll say like, haha, you've activated my trap card, and they won't have expected that, and it'll screw them over. So I think that's a little bit better actually than what Hearthstone has. And then you get into Artifact, and I think it's the best, and that's because Artifact just gets rid of it. It's a level of play that isn't really, I don't know how to say it without it coming off kind of like douchey and elitist. Like, oh, it's so erudite. The high level intellectual gameplay is just blowing my mind. But it kind of is, right? It's this idea that instead of these sort of mechanical decisions that you should be able to get right every time, or near enough, it removes that element of skill and says that's not important. It's not important to be able to just pick the right options in this little like calculation off, right? It says we'll just do that for you, and we'll leave you to think about things that are more like high level strategy instead. And I think that's actually a great thing to do. I think it makes the game more skillful in an interesting way, right? Or it at least focuses the efforts of the players to beat each other in a more interesting area. And it takes away something that can be a little tedious and something that essentially just exists to trip up new players, right? And replaces it perhaps with something that will trip up everyone, including professional players. And that is, I think, the kind of replacement is the three boards. You've got, it's so tricky. It still kind of blows my mind. You've got the 3 board states instead, right? And so at a micro level, you're playing on each one, and you're doing that really basic stuff. But there's not very much of it to do anymore, and it's very de-emphasized. You just cast your spells to impact the board state only. In Artifact. But you've got your 3 boards, and you can affect 1 board from another board, and so that impacts your the mind games, the higher levels of play, right? It impacts your metagame a little bit in terms of how you build your deck, and it impacts how you hugely impacts, I think, how you like think about faking out your opponent and the options you have for gaining advantage against your opponent, because you can do it in more than just one lane. You can do it across all 3 potentially, right? You have abilities at least that allow you to reach across multiple lanes. And you, even without that, even if you couldn't do anything to affect other lanes directly in this lane, you can still do stuff to like perhaps you know you don't want to actually kill her, right? But you want to push your opponent into a situation where they have to use a spell like No Accident to finish off Zeus. I don't think they have it here, but there's a spell that lets you swap unit locations. Let's say you swap these units around so that Phantom Assassin is still going to die and Zeus is going to live. And let's say that they had a coup de grace and they thought this lane was important, and you hoped that they would kill Zeus, right? Let's say they actually do it. Well, maybe the reason that you wanted to do that was so that you could play some other spell on a different character in the next lane, so you get to get advantage there. Obviously, very different from the actual situation in this game, but you get the point I'm making, right? Is that you can get your opponent to react to things in this lane that you don't care about, so that you can do something in the next lane that it's gonna make them wish they still had their reactionary ability to stop you with, right? And so it adds a lot, I think, to the upper levels of play, the levels of play that I think are very fun and very interesting to watch, like the mind games and the outthinking your opponent, having a person who has like the better strategy and really clearly like makes better meaningful choices, rather than the person who makes the fewest slip-ups in essentially meaningless choices, if that makes sense, right? So yeah, that's kind of that's levels of play. It's partly a fanboy piece on Artifact. Most of the videos I've made recently have been because I'm very, very excited for this game, or maybe it's that I found video topics I wanted to make about card games. I made them about Artifact, and I end up complimenting Artifact because I think that on the surface level, of course, like I've said in other videos, I suspect I'll have more criticisms or figure out what I should be criticizing once I've played the game a bit. But on the surface level, it feels like this game is doing a lot of things that I personally care about, the way I'd like to see someone do them. So it's very exciting for me. But yeah, I think the point is that you have these levels of play. Each of them is important. And aside from the fact that I think the way Artifact is doing it is great, keep them in mind. I guess that's my word to the viewers, right? Don't abandon one of these levels of play if you want to get good at these games. Learn about other decks than the one you're playing. Learn about building decks. Learn about customizing and tweaking decks to the meta. And learn about what other people read about, and get in conversations with people and find out what other people think, what other people are doing. Even if you don't agree with them, understanding how they think about the game is going to improve your ability to beat them. And don't just pay attention to everyone, of course, but especially pay attention to players who are good, but also pay attention to players that are bad. There's kind of a different skill involved sometimes in fooling new players, right? I've definitely burnt myself 1 or 2 times doing something that no one even noticed when introducing my friends to Magic, that I thought I was going to be faking them out. They had no idea I even did anything. Flew right over their heads, and it didn't work at all. But the idea was that versus the kind of people I was used to playing against, if I wasn't that subtle, they would realize what I was doing. So anyway, yeah, so you need to learn how bad players think. You need to learn how good players think. You need to learn how people think. You need to learn how people play the game. You need to learn how people build decks. And you need to learn how to do the playing the game and the building of decks and thinking across multiple lanes. So just don't neglect your different levels of play, and don't get caught up in the lowest level, the board state, right? The current board state you have right now. I think that's the biggest mistake I see people make when I introduce them to like Magic the Gathering, is that they get really caught up in like how things are right now. If it doesn't look good for them, they're really upset, and if it looks good for them, they think they got this in the bag, and they very well may have already lost at that point. And it's just really important to realize that this level of gameplay, this like, maybe it's, I feel like it should be obvious to everyone, but at the same time, I feel like if I say that, I'm being douche, you know, like, oh, I feel like this should be obvious to everyone because I'm so smart, right? And I'm trying not to say that, really. I guess the point is, I feel like this should be obvious to everyone, but it clearly isn't. I've met way too many people for whom it was not, and so I want to just say, realize that this level of play exists, and that's the most important thing, is thinking ahead and outthinking your opponent and baiting out your opponent. And once you know it exists, get good at it. And can you get good at it through practice? Absolutely, 100%. You can get better at this through practice. If you do it enough, you will get better at it. I can't promise you're going to be a pro player and go and win a artifact tournament or whatever, but you can get better. You absolutely 100% can. I've done it. I've seen other people do it. Just like with most things, it requires intentional practice. It's not something you can really get better at by accident. Yeah, okay, so I think that pretty much covers the topic. Thank you all for watching. Sorry that was a little bit more long-winded than it needed to be. Then again, all of my videos are. Yakri out.